The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood quietly in her private dressing room. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the simple black dress that had become all too familiar in recent months. Today would be different from all the other difficult days they had faced together. Today, she and William would say goodbye to someone who had been the cornerstone of their lives, their marriage, and the entire British monarchy. Prince William entered the room without his usual confident stride. His shoulders carried a weight that seemed to have grown heavier with each passing hour. Catherine looked at him through the mirror, and in that single glance, they shared the kind of understanding that only comes from years of partnership through both joy and sorrow. No words were needed. They both knew this day would test them in ways they had never imagined. The phone calls had started coming in before dawn. Prime ministers, presidents, and royalty from around the world had been reaching out, offering condolences and support. But for William and Catherine, this wasn't about protocol or state affairs. This was deeply personal. Queen Elizabeth II, the woman who had guided William since childhood and welcomed Catherine into the royal family with open arms, was gone. Catherine remembered her first private meeting with the Queen, years before she and William were married. She had been terrified, worried that she wouldn't measure up to royal standards, or that she might say something wrong. But the Queen had put her at ease with a gentle smile and a cup of tea, asking about her family and her studies. "The important thing," the Queen had said that day, "is not where you come from, but where your heart leads you." Those words had stayed with Catherine through every challenge of royal life. When the media criticized her background, when protocol seemed overwhelming, when the weight of public scrutiny felt unbearable, she would remember the Queen's wisdom and find strength to continue. The Queen had become more than a monarch to her. She had become a grandmother figure, a mentor, and a friend. William had grown up knowing that this day would eventually come, but understanding something intellectually and living through it emotionally were entirely different experiences. As a child, he had spent countless hours with his grandmother, learning not just about being a royal, but about being a good person. She had taught him that leadership wasn't about commanding others, but about serving them. She had shown him that strength could be quiet, that dignity could be maintained even in the most difficult circumstances. The Queen had been there for William during the darkest period of his life, when his mother, Princess Diana, died. While the world watched and speculated, the Queen had provided him with stability and unconditional love. She never tried to replace his mother, but she made sure he knew he was never alone. She taught him that grief was natural, that it was okay to feel lost, but that he had responsibilities that would help him find his way forward. Now, as William prepared to face the world as the heir to the throne, he felt the enormous responsibility settling on his shoulders. The Queen had spent 70 years preparing him for this moment, but he still felt unprepared for a world without her steady presence. Catherine reached for William's hand, intertwining their fingers the way they had done thousands of times before. But this time felt different. This time they were no longer the young couple being guided by the Queen's wisdom. They were now the senior royals, the ones who would need to provide strength and stability to others. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, had been told about their great-grandmother's passing the evening before. The conversation had been one of the most difficult of their lives as parents. How do you explain to children that the woman who read them stories, who laughed at their jokes, who always had time for them despite her busy schedule, would never be coming to visit again? 9-year-old George had understood more than his younger siblings. He had already been learning about his future role, and the Queen had begun teaching him about duty and service. His questions had been practical and heartbreaking at the same time. "Who will teach me about being a king now?" he had asked, his young voice trying to be brave. Charlotte, at 7 years old, had been more emotional. She had loved her great-grandmother's collection of jewelry and handbags, and the Queen had always let her try on bracelets and look at herself in ornate mirrors. "Will Gangan be watching from heaven?" Charlotte had asked, using the special name the children had for the Queen. 5-year-old Louis had been the most confused. He kept asking when the Queen would come for tea again, not fully understanding that gone meant forever. His innocence had made the conversation even more painful for William and Catherine. As they prepared to leave their private quarters and face the day ahead, Catherine thought about all the moments she had shared with the Queen that the public had never seen. The quiet conversations over afternoon tea, the advice about raising children in the spotlight, the gentle corrections when Catherine made mistakes with protocol. The Queen had never made her feel foolish or inadequate. Instead, she had patiently guided her, understanding that marrying into the royal family required learning an entirely new way of life. One memory stood out particularly clearly. It had been during the early days of Catherine's marriage, when she was struggling with the constant media attention. She had made a small mistake during a public engagement, and the newspapers had been harsh in their criticism. Catherine had been devastated, feeling like she was failing not just herself, but William and the entire royal family. The Queen had quietly asked Catherine to join her for a private walk in the gardens at Balmoral. As they walked among the flowers that the Queen loved so much, she had shared her own experiences of making mistakes early in her reign. "The important thing," the Queen had said, "is not that you never fall down. The important thing is how gracefully you get back up." That conversation had changed Catherine's perspective entirely. She realized that the Queen's grace and composure hadn't come naturally or easily. They had been developed through decades of experience, through making mistakes and learning from them, through facing criticism and finding ways to grow stronger. The Queen had also taught Catherine about the importance of family within the constraints of royal duty. She had shown her how to be a loving wife and mother, while also fulfilling public responsibilities. The Queen had managed to raise 4 children while serving as monarch, and she had shared practical advice about balancing family life with royal obligations. "Your children need to know that they are loved unconditionally," the Queen had once told Catherine. "Everything else they need to learn about their roles, about duty, about service, will follow naturally if they know they are secure in your love." William had received different but equally valuable lessons from his grandmother. She had taught him about the weight of the crown, but also about finding joy and meaning in service. She had shown him that being king wasn't about personal power, but about being a symbol of stability and continuity for millions of people. The Queen had also helped William understand his mother's legacy in a way that honored Diana's memory while preparing him for his own future role. She had never spoken negatively about Diana, even during the most difficult periods after the divorce. Instead, she had helped William see how his mother's compassion and connection with people could be channeled into effective royal service. As the morning progressed, William and Catherine knew they would soon need to make their first public appearance since the Queen's passing. The world would be watching, looking for signs of how they were coping, how they would carry forward the Queen's legacy. The pressure was enormous, but they had learned from the Queen that duty sometimes meant performing even when your heart was breaking. The Queen's final lesson to them had come in her last weeks. Even as her health declined, she had continued working, continued fulfilling her responsibilities as monarch. She had shown them that service to others could provide strength even in the face of personal suffering. Her dedication had been both inspiring and humbling. Catherine looked at herself in the mirror one final time, adjusting the simple pearl earrings that had been a gift from the Queen. William straightened his tie, a gesture so automatic that he didn't even realize he was doing it. They were ready to face the world, to begin the process of saying goodbye to the woman who had shaped their lives in countless ways. As they walked together toward the door, both knew that everything was about to change. The Queen's death marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of their new roles as the Prince and Princess of Wales. The lessons she had taught them would guide them forward, but they would have to find their own way of serving, their own style of leadership. The world outside was waiting, full of people who were also grieving the loss of their queen. William and Catherine's private sorrow would soon become a public farewell, shared with millions of people around the globe who had also loved and admired the queen. Their personal grief would need to be channeled into strength for others, just as the queen had taught them through her own example of selfless service. The great doors of Westminster Abbey stood open, revealing centuries of history within its ancient walls. As Catherine and William arrived at the Abbey, they were greeted by a scene that would have amazed even the Queen herself. World leaders, royalty, and dignitaries from every corner of the globe had gathered to pay their final respects. The Queen, who had once been a young woman thrust into an unexpected role, had become a beloved figure whose influence reached far beyond the borders of Britain. Catherine felt her breath catch as she saw the Abbey filled to capacity. Every seat was occupied by someone whose life had been touched by the Queen's service. Presidents and prime ministers sat alongside charity workers and community leaders. The Queen had always insisted that her funeral should reflect the diversity of the people she had served, and seeing her final wish fulfilled brought both comfort and fresh waves of emotion. William guided Catherine to their seats in the front row, where their children were already waiting. George sat straight and composed, trying to follow his father's example of quiet dignity. Charlotte held tightly to her small handbag, inside which she carried a photograph of herself with the Queen taken just months earlier. Louis, despite his young age, seemed to understand the solemnity of the moment, his usual playful energy replaced by unusual stillness. The Archbishop of Canterbury began the service with words that seemed to echo through the centuries. "We gather today not just to mourn, but to celebrate a life of extraordinary service, dedication, and love." His voice carried clearly through the Abbey, but for William and Catherine, the formal words seemed distant. They were lost in their own memories, their own private moments with the woman they had loved and respected. As the service continued, Catherine found herself remembering the Queen's laugh. It wasn't something the public often heard, but in private moments, the Queen had possessed a wonderful sense of humor. She had delighted in stories about the children, had chuckled at William's jokes, and had even occasionally shared amusing observations about the various characters she had met during her long reign. One particular memory made Catherine smile despite her tears. During a family gathering at Balmoral, Louis had been particularly mischievous, hiding behind curtains and startling guests. Rather than being annoyed, the Queen had entered into the spirit of the game, pretending to be surprised each time Louis jumped out. Later, she had quietly told Catherine, "Let him be a child while he can. The responsibilities will come soon enough." William was remembering his last private conversation with his grandmother. She had been weak, but her mind had been as sharp as ever. They had talked about his future role, about the changes that would need to be made, about the challenges facing the monarchy in the modern world. But mostly, she had talked about the importance of staying connected to the people they served. "The crown is not about us," she had told him. "It never has been. We are simply the custodians of something larger than ourselves. Remember that, and you will never lose your way." Those words echoed in William's mind as he looked around the Abbey. The Queen had understood that her role was to serve as a bridge between the past and the future, to provide stability in times of change, to be a symbol of continuity in an ever-changing world. Now that responsibility would fall to him, and he felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. The service included readings from world leaders who had worked with the Queen over her 7 decades of service. Each speaker shared memories of her wisdom, her grace, and her unwavering commitment to her duties. But for Catherine and William, the most moving moments came when ordinary citizens shared their memories of meeting the Queen during her many public engagements. A nurse from a London hospital spoke about the Queen's visit during the worst days of the pandemic. Despite the risks to her own health, the Queen had insisted on meeting with healthcare workers to thank them for their service. She had spent far longer than scheduled talking with each person, asking about their families, their challenges, their hopes for the future. A young teacher from Wales described the Queen's visit to his school in an underprivileged area. The Queen had not just made the expected formal appearance. She had sat with the children, listened to them read, and asked thoughtful questions about their dreams and ambitions. Years later, many of those students had pursued higher education, inspired partly by the Queen's belief in their potential. These stories reminded William and Catherine why the Queen's life had mattered to so many people. She had never seen her role as ceremonial or symbolic only. For her, every public engagement had been an opportunity to connect with people, to learn about their lives, and to show them that they mattered to their monarch. As the service neared its most emotional moments, Catherine reached for William's hand. They both knew that what came next would test their composure in ways they had never experienced. The final farewell was approaching, and they would need to find strength not just for themselves, but for their children and for all the people watching around the world. The Queen's coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, represented the end of the longest reign in British history. But for William and Catherine, it represented the loss of a beloved family member who had guided them through the most important years of their lives. George, sitting between his parents, had been remarkably composed throughout the service. But as the final hymn began, Catherine saw tears beginning to form in his young eyes. He was old enough to understand that his great-grandmother was gone, old enough to know that his own life would now change in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Catherine gently placed her arm around George, pulling him closer. In that moment, she realized that comforting him was helping her find her own strength. The Queen had often told her that focusing on others was the best way to manage personal pain, and once again, her grandmother-in-law's wisdom proved true. Charlotte was struggling with her emotions in a different way. She kept looking around the Abbey as if expecting to see the Queen walking down the aisle, ready to sit with the family as she had done at so many other important occasions. The finality of death was a concept that her 7-year-old mind was still trying to process. Louis, despite his young age, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. He sat unusually still, occasionally reaching up to touch William's arm as if seeking reassurance. William would gently pat his youngest son's hand, providing comfort while trying to maintain his own composure. The Archbishop's final words brought the service to its conclusion. "Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Honor everyone. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit." As the congregation prepared for the final procession, Catherine felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The formal service was ending, but the hardest part was yet to come. Soon they would accompany the Queen on her final journey to Windsor Castle, where she would be laid to rest beside her beloved husband, Prince Philip. The procession from Westminster Abbey to Windsor Castle would be watched by millions of people around the world. Catherine and William would need to maintain their composure while sharing their grief with the entire planet. The Queen had always understood the public nature of royal sorrow, and she had prepared them for this moment through her own example of grace under pressure. As they prepared to leave the Abbey, William and Catherine took a moment to look around at the magnificent building where they had been married 11 years earlier. The Queen had been there that day, beaming with joy as she watched her grandson marry the woman he loved. She had welcomed Catherine into the family with open arms and had been a constant source of support throughout their marriage. Now they were leaving the same building under very different circumstances. The joy of their wedding day had been replaced by the solemnity of farewell, but the love and support they felt from each other remained unchanged. The Queen had taught them that marriage was not just about personal happiness, but about supporting each other through whatever challenges life might bring. As they walked toward the Abbey doors, Catherine caught sight of herself in one of the ornate windows. She was surprised to see that despite her emotional turmoil, she looked composed and dignified. The Queen's lessons about public service had become so much a part of her that she could draw on them even in her darkest moments. The crowd outside the Abbey was enormous but respectfully quiet. Thousands of people had gathered to pay their respects, many of them holding flowers or small photographs of the Queen. As William and Catherine appeared, a spontaneous round of applause began, growing louder as more people joined in. It was a sound of gratitude and support, a recognition of their loss and their courage in sharing it publicly. Catherine felt tears threatening again as she saw the outpouring of love from the crowd. These people understood that she and William were not just royal figures fulfilling ceremonial duties. They were a family saying goodbye to someone they loved, and the public was showing them that they were not alone in their grief. The journey from Westminster Abbey to Windsor Castle had been a moving river of humanity. Along every mile of the route, people had gathered to say their own farewells to the Queen. Some threw flowers, others simply stood in respectful silence, but all seemed to understand that they were witnessing the end of an era. For Catherine and William, sitting in the car behind the hearse, the sight of so many people sharing in their grief was both overwhelming and comforting. As Windsor Castle came into view, Catherine felt her composure beginning to crack. This was where some of her most precious memories with the Queen had been made. Weekend visits with the children, quiet dinners when the Queen would ask about their schools and interests, long walks in the gardens where the Queen would share stories about the castle's history and her own childhood memories. The private burial service at St. George's Chapel would be smaller and more intimate than the state funeral. Only close family members and personal friends would be present. For Catherine and William, this meant they could finally allow themselves to grieve more openly, without the weight of public expectation pressing down on them. William helped Catherine from the car, and together they walked slowly toward the chapel where his grandfather, Prince Philip, had been laid to rest just over a year earlier. The Queen had missed Philip terribly during those final months, often speaking about looking forward to being reunited with him. There was comfort in knowing that they would now be together again. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere was markedly different from the grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Here, surrounded by family, the formal protocols gave way to genuine emotion. Catherine saw tears in the eyes of family members who had managed to remain composed throughout the public service. The privacy of this moment allowed everyone to finally acknowledge the depth of their loss. Their children had handled the day with remarkable maturity, but Catherine could see that they were exhausted by the emotional weight of the occasion. George had been particularly brave, understanding that as the future king, people would be watching how he behaved. But he was still just a 9-year-old boy who had lost his beloved great-grandmother. Charlotte had been quietly asking questions throughout the day. "Where will Gon live now?" she had whispered to Catherine during the car journey. "Will she have her corgis with her in heaven?" These innocent questions had been heartbreaking, but also touching in their simple faith and love. Louis, despite his young age, had seemed to understand that this was a day when he needed to be on his best behavior. He had held William's hand throughout much of the service, providing comfort to his father even while needing comfort himself. As the committal service began, William found himself thinking about the future. The Queen had spent decades preparing him for the role he would now assume, but he had always imagined she would be there to guide him through the early years of his reign. Now he would need to find his own way, drawing on her lessons, but adapting them for a new era. Catherine was thinking about the promises she had made to the Queen, both spoken and unspoken. She had promised to support William in his role, to raise their children with an understanding of service and duty, and to use her position to make a positive difference in the world. These promises felt even more important now that the Queen was no longer there to see them fulfilled. The Queen's final message to her family had been read earlier in the day. In it, she had expressed her love for each of them and her confidence in their ability to carry forward the work she had begun. She had reminded them that the monarchy existed to serve the people, not the other way around, and that their personal happiness must always be balanced with their public duties. To William, she had written, "You have grown into the man I always hoped you would become. Trust your instincts, lean on Catherine's strength, and never forget that leadership is about lifting others up, not elevating yourself." To Catherine, her message had been equally personal. "You have brought such joy to our family and such grace to your role. Your compassion and your determination to make a difference will serve you well. Help William remember that it's okay to be human, even when wearing the crown." These words had given both of them comfort and strength, but they had also emphasized the enormous responsibility that now rested on their shoulders. They were no longer the younger generation being guided by the Queen's wisdom. They were now the senior royals, the ones who would need to provide stability and leadership for the monarchy and the country. As the service concluded, the family gathered for a few moments of private reflection. Catherine looked around at the familiar faces, all marked by grief, but also by determination to honor the Queen's legacy. Charles, now King Charles III, looked older and more worn than she had ever seen him, but he also carried himself with a new authority and purpose. Camilla, the Queen Consort, had been a source of quiet strength throughout the day. She had supported Charles while also providing comfort to other family members. Catherine had always admired Camilla's resilience and her ability to find her place within the royal family despite the challenges she had faced. William's brother Harry had returned for the funeral, creating a bittersweet reunion that the Queen would have appreciated. Despite the tensions that had developed within the family, the Queen's death had reminded everyone of what truly mattered. The sight of William and Harry walking together behind their grandmother's coffin had moved people around the world. As the family began to disperse, Catherine and William lingered in the chapel for a few extra moments. They wanted to say their own private goodbye, away from the cameras and the crowds. In the quiet of the ancient chapel, surrounded by centuries of history, they finally allowed themselves to fully feel the weight of their loss. Catherine thought about all the advice the Queen had given her over the years, how to handle criticism with dignity, how to balance family life with royal duties, how to use her platform to highlight causes she cared about. The Queen had been more than a grandmother-in-law. She had been a mentor and a friend. William remembered the countless conversations he had shared with the Queen about leadership, duty, and service. She had taught him that being king was not about personal power, but about being a servant to the people. She had shown him that the crown was a burden to be carried with grace, not a privilege to be enjoyed. As they prepared to leave the chapel, Catherine and William both felt a strange mixture of endings and beginnings. The Queen's death marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of their new roles as the Prince and Princess of Wales. The lessons she had taught them would guide them forward, but they would need to find their own way of serving their country and the Commonwealth. Outside the chapel, their children were waiting with other family members. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been remarkably patient throughout the long day, but Catherine could see that they were ready to return to some sense of normalcy. The Queen had always emphasized the importance of family, and Catherine and William were determined to maintain that priority even as their public responsibilities increased. The drive back to their home was quiet. The children dozed in the car, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. Catherine and William sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what the future would hold. That evening, as they tucked their children into bed, the conversations were gentle and reassuring. George asked thoughtful questions about what would happen next, showing a maturity beyond his years. Charlotte wanted to know if they could visit the Queen's grave and bring flowers. Louis, still struggling to understand the permanence of death, asked when they would see the Queen again. Catherine and William answered as honestly as they could, while providing comfort and security. They talked about how the Queen would always be with them in their memories, how her love would continue to guide them, and how they would honor her by continuing the work she had started. Later that night, when the children were finally asleep, Catherine and William sat together in their private sitting room. The day had been exhausting but also meaningful. They had said goodbye to the Queen in a way that honored her life and her service, surrounded by people who had loved and respected her. They talked about the future, about the challenges they would face, about the opportunities they would have to make a positive difference. The Queen's death had reminded them of the fragility of life and the importance of using their time wisely. As they prepared for bed, Catherine looked at the photographs on their dressing table. Pictures of their wedding day, family gatherings, official portraits, and candid moments with the Queen and the children. These images told the story of their life together, a life that had been enriched and guided by the Queen's presence. The Queen's final lesson had been taught through her death itself. She had shown them that a life of service, lived with dignity and grace, could touch millions of people and leave a lasting legacy. Her influence would continue through the work of her family, through the institutions she had supported, and through the example she had set. As Catherine turned off the light, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for having known the Queen and for the privilege of being part of her family. The grief would continue, but so would the love and the commitment to service that the Queen had instilled in all of them. The world had said goodbye to a remarkable woman, but her legacy would live on through the lives she had touched and the family she had raised to continue her work. For Catherine and William, the farewell marked not just an ending, but the beginning of their own chapter in the continuing story of service, duty, and love that the Queen had written with her extraordinary life.